Well, for those of you who don't know me, just a quick introduction. My name is Florian Lorétan. I'm one of the co-founders of Wunderkraut, and we do a lot of multilingual websites. We do websites in Germany and also a lot of them in Switzerland, where every website has to be at least bilingual, if not trilingual or quadrilingual. So this means that we've got a lot of things to do with multilingual content. And one of the things that has changed the way that we work over the past year is entity translation. So Gabor mentioned a little bit earlier about entity translation and how that works, how that will work for Drupal 8. He went into a little bit of detail, and I know that, this topic has been covered to a certain extent today already. I heard that it was also mentioned in the notes translation. So I know that everybody just wants to go and get some beer. So we're just going to go through what it means, what entity translation means for Drupal 7. Just do it quickly, and then we can have a good time today at the party. So entity translation is about the translation of content. A lot of people think that entity translation will also resolve all the issues that you have with the I-89 suite of modules. No, that's a different story. Entity translation is about translating content. In Drupal, there's actually two ways to translate content. The first one is the traditional way, the way that has been there since 4.7. It's content translation. And I think as of Drupal 5, I believe there's content translation inside of Drupal core. It's also sometimes we refer to as no translation. And what I'm going to be talking about today is entity translation, also called field translation sometimes. So let's take a look at how that works. So this is first the traditional model. We have one node that is in a specific language. This node has fields like a title, a body, just various information. And then, that node also has one ID that just identifies it just identifies this object. And when we make a translation, we create a separate node with a separate identifier, and it has a copy of everything. The drawback with this is that you really have two separate objects that are weakly linked together, and it makes things a little bit problematic. For example, if you have references between nodes, and you want to keep those references consistent across languages, to which one of the two nodes are you going to be referring to? So there's some ways to work around that, but it's really not elegant. And the way that we would like to work is to have just one item, and inside of that item, there are things that are translated. And those different things that are translated, they are still part of the same element. So this is the ideal situation. Again, here we only have one ID, which means that there's no, and it doesn't matter what language you're making a reference from, you always use the same identifier. So your data structure is much more consistent. And so this is where entity translation comes in. Just to get an idea, who here has already worked with entity translation? Okay, so a good amount of people. And for the other ones, you might have seen when working with Drupal 7 that compared to CCK and Drupal 6, in the field structure you get a language code. In this case, German, sometimes it's UND for undefined, sometimes it's English or whatever language you might be working in. And this language code can be a pain in the ass sometimes, but it's also very practical. And the reason it's there, it is because the field API has this built-in translatability. It's not available to the user through a user interface, and it's pretty much the job of the entity translation module to provide an interface to access those separate languages that can be stored within one field. The advantage of storing things this way is that you have a semantic structure. This is what you would get with using the DPM function from devel module to look at the content of a node. If you look, we have a description field, which in this case is available in English, in French, and in Dutch. So this is text that gets translated. We also have an image, but the image does not get translated. And so you see that it is indicated with U and D as a language code. And so you really have a structure that does not have any duplicate data, and it only translates things that are meant to be translated, unlike the standard node translation model. One of the big advantages of using entity translation is that it doesn't only work for contents, well, for nodes. It also works for anything that is fieldable, any entity. So it works for users, it works for taxonomy terms, it works for comments. Well, translating comments usually doesn't make much sense, but you could translate comments if you wanted to. And it works for anything that is an entity. So if you have some additional entities like Drupal commerce items.
What about node titles?
I'm coming to that. Just a second. So the advantage too is that you get to define for each field if you want to translate it or not. Generally, you want to translate text fields, and you don't want to translate number fields or image fields. But there are some cases where you want to not translate text fields. For example, if you have a name field, generally the name stays the same in all languages. Or if you have an image that contains text, you might want to have that image translated. Or if you have a PDF file that also contains information in a specific language, you might want to translate that field. So, again, to your question, what can be translated and what can't? So, the entity translation module really works around well, it provides an interface for that functionality provided by the field API. So it works for both fields. Entity translation also provides some additional metadata about the translations themselves. When was a translation saved, and so on. But there are things that cannot be translated. The properties of entities. So the author, the promoted date, promoted status, creation date, modification date. These are all things that can't be translated. Usually it's not that big of a deal. We don't really need those. The problem is that title is also one of these properties that cannot be translated. And if you, well, I've never tried, but I guess if you tell one of your clients, sorry, the title of the page cannot be translated, they're going to stop working with you. So we really need to be able to translate the title. And just for this case, for this use case, there is the title module. The title module adds a new field called field title that replaces automatically the title of a node. And so it works transparently that when you save a node, it will replace the title, and when you load the node, it will load the correct title for the language that you are loading the node. It also does the same things for taxonomy term name, taxonomy term description, and it works just pretty much transparently. You just enable it, and you need to replace those titles, and then it just works. But there's one case where it doesn't really work, and I want to dedicate one slide to this because we've done a good amount of coaching, of helping other people get up to speed with entity translation. And this is the part where everybody spends a couple hours and saying, oh, my listing of nodes. I just have a listing of node titles and it's not getting translated. What am I doing wrong? The thing is that in this case, you want to use the field title, so the field that is a replacement for the title. If you just use the title, so the property, it will not get translated. If you use field title in this case, yeah.
I kind of made a twist on that. There is a patch for entity API that exposes the entity label as a views feed.
Okay.
So you can put empty label in there, and that will work transparently.
Okay.
If you wanna for some reason.
Does it also remove the title as an option?
No.
No, because.
Unfortunately not. But
okay, so just imagine, don't use title, use entity label. Thanks. Is this applied already?
It's still in easy view. So right now it's like that. But
okay.
please review the patch.
Yes. Another nice advantage of entity translation is the language fallback. With the standard translation mechanism, what you typically get is that, well, you have all the language, all the content that is available in your language that is displayed. If you have menu items, well, if that content is displayed in navigation, it will be displayed when you have that language. And if you have content, well, if you switch to a language where you don't have that much content, you're pretty much not going to see anything, which is sometimes a problem because, well, you know that your clients, when they're responsible for entering the contents, that can take some time, and when they're responsible for translating the contents, that can take even longer. And it's something that's expensive, and we have to understand that, well, you know, they're not going to keep the websites 100% translated. But at the same time, there are things that are not translated that everybody should see. A good example of that is a product catalog that we did for a customer, and they had their catalog that was translated into 2 languages, but they also had the rest of the website with just some static content that was translated in 7 languages. And if we had used the regular translation model, pretty much the people using the 5 remaining languages would not have seen anything from the catalog. And if we use the language fallback, it means that we can say if the content is not available in your language, we are going to go through the list of languages and look if there's anything that's available and pick the first one. But this is something that you can enable or disable, but it can be very practical. And there are some cases where it really makes sense to do that. So as I mentioned earlier, entity translation does not replace I18N, but there's a way that entity translation and I18N interact a little bit. Entity translation does not do anything with menus, really, so you still need I18N menu in order to be able to translate menu items. And entity translation also takes care of the content of fields, but it does not translate field information like field labels, field descriptions, and for this you still need I18N fields. There's a couple modules from I18N that you should explicitly not use with entity translation. One of them is I18N select, which filters the content that's available to make sure that only the content in your language is displayed, but it makes some assumptions about how the content is stored that really break that, well, it conflicts with entity translation, and so it's going to hide content that you don't want to be hidden. So make sure that you don't use I18N select with entity translation. Also, I18N taxonomy was used to be a way to translate taxonomy terms, and it was very, very painful. It had a lot of drawbacks. And this is one use case where entity translation really makes a lot of sense. It's for the translation of categories, of tags. So you really want to use entity translation for the translation of taxonomy terms instead of I18N taxonomy. You can forget about that one. So it seems that entity translation is the great solution that we've been waiting for all along. It's great, but, well, unfortunately, there's a couple of things that are not, they're not optimal. First one is that the user interface needs a little bit of work. What I'm talking about here is that entity translation makes use of that option that you have with the field API to store multilingual content. The problem is that most of Drupal core makes some assumptions about content having only one language. It means that some user interface components don't really make sense. So this is just a screenshot of the content overview page. When you enable entity translation, suddenly this language column does not make much sense because it's not the language of the content. It is just the original language of the content. And if you look at the node titles, it will always load the title that is in your language. So in this case, I have a node that was originally in English that I have translated in French. I'm looking at the page in French, and I have the English displayed there. So it's kind of confusing for the users. So, well, what is it? Is it English? Is it French? And also, what is going to happen once I click on the edit link there? So there's a little bit of confusion there. So I know that this is one of the forms that most people override on most projects because it's just god-awful to use. But still, it's something that if we want to make entity translation a standard component, we need to work on those things. There's also the integration with other modules that need some work. Path auto has been resolved now, so you have your path aliases that are generated automatically for every translation. But there's a couple other modules that work in a similar way that also need some special attention, like redirection. And so it means that everything will, well, there's a lot of modules that make some assumptions about how translations are stored, and some of these assumptions tend to break. These are all things that we can have workarounds. There's one problem where we currently don't have a workaround. It's revisioning. Revisioning works in Drupal with nodes in the way that it just creates a revision. When you decide to create a new revision, it creates a revision for the entire node. This means that when we create a translation with entity translation, it's also saving the entire node, meaning all the languages. If you have, let's say, 10 languages, just creating the node and adding the 9 translations, this already creates 10 versions of your code. And if you say that, well, someone makes a revision in one language, it will affect the other languages. Someone reverts a revision in one language, it might erase the work that has been done by others in other languages. So this can be pretty nasty. And so we really want to make sure that we find a way that really makes revisioning work well, in a way that doesn't have these drawbacks. This is also something that we need to figure out before we put entity translation into Drupal 8. But I'll get back to this in a little bit. Another thing that is, well, it's not worse, but it's just different, that menu items still need to be translated differently. Maybe if we can look at it visually, for regular, well, the content translation, well, node translation way to add menu items to content is that, well, you have one node per language, and you also have one menu item per language. This works okay, it just creates a lot of menu items, and if you have a lot of languages, well, you have that many times more menu items. And the problem is that when you try to have a hierarchy, then you need to duplicate that hierarchy for every language. So if you have 2 languages, it's okay. If you have 3, it starts to lose. It's not really clear anymore. If you have 10 languages, this really is not an option anymore. The way that we can do it with entity translation is that, well, we have one node that has all the languages, and then we have multiple menu items, each of them having one language that all points to the same thing. Or we can have one node that has all the languages and one menu item for that node, and then just have different menu translation using the ITN menu module. All these, well, both of these variants have advantages and drawbacks. And one of the problems is that the menu form that is added on the node edit form makes a lot of assumptions about how that node is going to be, again, assuming that this node will only have one language. And the best way that we found to do this is to actually remove the menu form from the node editing form and put this as a separate step before creating the form. I don't know if anybody was here this morning for the presentation from my colleagues Andy and Daniel. They showed a way to work around the menu structure and the menu user interface that kind of turns everything around, and it just moves the problem to a different place, kind of partially removing this problem. So as a summary, well, entity translation is not entirely there yet, but in most cases it's actually a much better solution than working with the standard node translation. We use it in production. We've been using it for about 6 months, something like that, and it does solve a lot of problems. But again, you need to be aware of the drawbacks and be aware of the limitations. So I would definitely encourage you to have a look at it. I know that there is a release coming up soon in Alpha 2. Until then, use the dev release. It has a lot of improvements compared to the first Alpha release. Yeah, try it, take a look at it, submit patches. We have one of the co-maintainers here. Yay! And well, one of the questions that I hear a lot, well, what's the plan for Drupal 8? And well, there are a couple of things that we can take from this to put into Drupal 8. The goal is really to have a translation mechanism that is similar to this in Drupal 8. But before we do that, we really need to work out those issues around revisioning, around menu, because we cannot ship Drupal 8 with entity translation and those issues still being around. And these are very difficult questions, both from a usability point of view and also from a data structure point of view. So it is a difficult task, but this is definitely the way that we're heading. And so it makes a lot of sense for Drupal 7 project to already be using entity translation, because we are already going to have that kind of data structure, and it would make upgrades a lot easier once we move to Drupal 8. So, do you have any questions?
How will the menu issue improve if you are using menu structure from taxonomy?
Okay, so like for example using taxonomy menu? Yeah. Well, you can do it. Yeah, you can definitely do it, but again, taxonomy menu makes some assumptions about, well, how the taxonomy is going to be translated and how the menu translation needs to match that. So you actually, it's possible to integrate it. We've done some custom work to make it work. So it's possible. We still need to contribute this as a patch to taxonomy menu, because taxonomy menu already integrates with ITN and taxonomy. So it's pretty much the same kind of mechanism. But yeah, at the moment it needs a little bit of work, but it's possible. Any other questions?
Will the title field be in the report? Will the title field be in the report and in the play?
The title field will not be in Drupal core, but the way that, well, it's a different solution to the problem. There will be a label method. So the label will get the title. Well, I guess yeah, there will probably be a title field, but the way that this title is loaded will be a little bit different.
I guess there was a thought about going even further and just have fields anyway to all them, right? 8, right?
So, well, there is a plan to make all properties translatable, but the title is really not a property. It's really, I think that it makes sense to have it as a field, and then, well, the problem is that the title is at the same time a field, and really something that you need to have it to, I mean, just to create a link to somewhere, you need to have that title field. So it makes sense to have a generic method to just give that information. Well, if you have any questions, you can contact me online, or I'll be around tomorrow too. So just come and talk to me. Thanks.